The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old house, rattling the decayed wooden shutters like skeletal fingers tapping a drum. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of Halloween, a chorus of distant laughter, the scuffle of hurried feet crunching through dry leaves, and the flickering of jack-o'-lanterns casting a pale, mocking light across the street. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far different. Cold, silent, expectant. A group of 6 teenagers sat around an ancient, dust-covered table in the dimly lit living room, their faces half concealed in the flickering shadows of candlelight. Among them was a woman named Emily, in her late 20s, who had reluctantly agreed to join her younger sister, Claire, and her friends for what she thought would be a typical Halloween night. She felt out of place, a reluctant guardian dragged into this world of youthful games and make-believe. But the house, an abandoned mansion known locally as the Holloway House, had a reputation that made even Emily's rational mind uneasy. The others were excited, eager to prove their courage. Someone had brought an old Ouija board, found in the attic earlier that day, its wood warped and cracked with age, its letters faint but still visible. Emily had protested, but her sister's friends laughed off her concerns, claiming it was all just for fun. "Nothing ever happens. It's just a game," one of them had said. But as they gathered around the table, Emily felt a prickle at the back of her neck. The kind of feeling that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with survival instinct. Something was wrong. The house seemed to breathe, its walls groaning under the weight of unseen memories, secrets that had been buried long before any of them were born. "Let's begin," Claire said, her voice unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The planchette, a small heart-shaped piece of wood, was placed at the center of the board, and they each rested their fingers on it. At first, the questions were silly, the kind that young minds full of bravado asked to entertain themselves. "Is anyone here with us?" For a while, nothing happened. The group chuckled nervously, exchanging glances. But then the planchette jerked forward, slow but deliberate, sliding over the letters as if guided by an unseen hand. E-M-I-L-Y. Her breath caught in her throat, her name spelled out in front of everyone. "That's not funny," Emily whispered, her voice shaky, though no one had spoken a word. She stared at the board, but none of the others seemed to notice her unease. "Who are you?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly, though still carrying an edge of disbelief. The board remained still for a moment, and then slowly the planchette began to move again. T-A-P-P-E-D. The candles flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. The room grew cold, unnaturally so. Emily's heartbeat quickened, a low hum rising in her ears as if the house itself was whispering, beckoning. "Stop it," Emily said, pulling her fingers from the planchette. "This isn't funny anymore." Her voice echoed louder than she intended, but the others were staring, wide-eyed at the board. The planchette had begun to move on its own, without their hands guiding it now. "Help me." The words appeared slowly, as though etched by an invisible force. And then, before anyone could react, there was a loud crash from the hallway outside the room. Everyone jumped, their eyes darting toward the darkened doorway. For a moment, silence reigned, but Emily swore she heard something. A faint, scraping sound like nails on wood, coming from the shadows beyond the door. "I think we should leave," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. But before anyone could move, the sound returned, louder this time, closer. A scraping, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. And then the whispering began. Low, guttural, unintelligible, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around them. As if in response, the planchette moved once more, spelling out its final message in sharp, jerking motions. "It's too late." Emily's heart froze as the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the candles were extinguished all at once, plunging the room into darkness. She felt something cold, something wet, brush against her hand. And then, just as suddenly, the whispering stopped. But in the silence that followed, Emily realized one thing with a chilling certainty. They were no longer alone in the house. The silence that followed the extinguishing of the candles was not merely the absence of sound. It was a palpable, suffocating void, as though the very air had thickened with dread. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she groped through the blackness, searching for the others. She found nothing but the cold, stale air of the room, a stifling sense of emptiness where the warmth of life should have been. "Claire?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The echo returned to her, mocking in its hollow repetition. There was no reply. Suddenly, the boards beneath her feet creaked, though she had not moved. It was as if something unseen was stirring beneath the surface, shifting with slow, deliberate purpose. Emily's heart pounded, her pulse loud in her ears. The oppressive sensation of being watched crept over her, an ancient, predatory gaze that seemed to peer at her from the shadows, unseen but undeniable. Then, as if from the depths of some hellish abyss, came a soft, dragging sound. It was faint at first, a mere whisper against the wooden floor, but it grew louder, more insistent, like a thing of unimaginable weight being pulled toward them. Emily's legs refused to move. She stood paralyzed, her mind grappling with the impossible reality that was unfolding. The others, Claire, her friends, had vanished into the dark. No sound of breathing, no whisper of movement, only that ceaseless dragging, coming ever closer. Emily's eyes strained in the dark, desperate for any glimpse of light, any indication that this nightmare was simply the product of overactive imaginations and the suffocating weight of the old house's atmosphere. But what she saw was far worse. At first it was barely discernible, a shimmer in the black, a distortion in the very fabric of reality. But as her eyes adjusted, the shimmering became more distinct, coalescing into a grotesque form. It slithered toward her, hunched and unnatural, its shape constantly shifting as though it were made of smoke, writhing and twisting in ways that defied logic. And then she saw its eyes, pale, milky, void of all life but filled with a deep, consuming hunger. The thing seemed to hesitate, its gaze fixed upon her, as if savoring her terror. Emily stumbled backward, her mind racing to make sense of what stood before her. This was no ghost, no simple manifestation of the dead. It was something far older, something born of the spaces between worlds, an ancient thing, forgotten by time but awakened by the foolish hands that had disturbed the Ouija board. Her hands fumbled in the dark, desperate to find something, anything, to protect herself. But the room, once familiar in its disorder, now seemed vast and alien, as though it had been swallowed by the thing's very presence. The cold grew unbearable, biting at her skin as if the air itself had turned hostile. The dragging sound grew louder, now unmistakable. It was not merely a presence, but a force, something vast and relentless, moving toward her with the slow inevitability of a nightmare that refuses to end. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave a sickening groan, and the wood splintered. She felt herself sinking, as if the very earth was pulling her under. In a panic, Emily flailed, her hands striking the floor in a desperate attempt to grasp onto something solid. Her fingers found purchase on the ragged edge of a splintered board, and she pulled herself up, just as the ground beneath her yawned open like a mouth, revealing a black, gaping chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. Out of that chasm came the whispers. They were no longer faint, distant things, but loud, insistent, and terrifyingly clear. They called her name, but it was not the voice of her sister or her friends. It was the voice of the house itself, ancient and malevolent, resonating from the very bones of the earth. The words were not of any language she knew, but their meaning was unmistakable, a promise of doom, of eternal suffering. Emily clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside her mind, crawling through her thoughts like a parasite. Her vision blurred, her body weakening as the whispers grew louder, pulling her ever closer to the gaping maw beneath the floor. In a final, desperate act, she reached for the Ouija board, which still lay on the table untouched since the candles had gone out. She grabbed the planchette, her hands trembling as she placed it back on the board. Through the haze of her terror, a single thought pushed through the madness. I need to stop this. I need to close whatever we've opened. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking with fear and desperation. Tell me how to stop it. The planchette jerked violently beneath her fingers, moving with a force that nearly knocked it from her grasp. Slowly, it spelled out a single word: run. As if obeying a command she could not resist, Emily stumbled to her feet. But before she could take a step, the floorboards split open completely, revealing a pulsating, writhing mass of shadow and smoke. From its depths, a hand, if one could call it that, emerged. It was gnarled and twisted, like the roots of a dead tree. Its fingers impossibly long, tipped with jagged claws. The hand reached for her, its touch cold as death itself. And then, in the darkness, she saw it. An ancient symbol etched into the floorboards beneath the table. A sigil, hidden beneath layers of dust and grime, glowing faintly in the dim light. Emily didn't know what it meant, but she knew instinctively that it was the key. The symbol pulsed with a dark energy, and the air around her seemed to throb with malevolent intent. But the creature was closing in, its breath cold and rank on her neck. She could feel its presence, a tangible weight pressing down on her. There was no time. She reached for the sigil, her fingers brushing its rough surface, and the world went silent. The silence that engulfed Emily was not a relief, but a void, an emptiness so profound that it swallowed even the sound of her own breath. For a moment, she thought she had slipped into some netherworld, a place between the living and the dead. The oppressive darkness still clung to her, but now there was something else, something colder, deeper. The floor beneath her feet no longer felt solid. It was as though she stood on the very threshold of the abyss itself. Slowly, the oppressive quiet gave way to a low, rhythmic sound, barely discernible but unmistakable, the distant thump-thump of a heartbeat. But this was no human rhythm. It was far too slow, too ancient. Each beat seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house, a pulse older than time, tied to something beyond comprehension. The sigil beneath her feet glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with that infernal heartbeat. Emily felt it, deep within her bones, the vibration rattling her insides, shaking the very core of her being. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as they traced the intricate patterns carved into the floor. It was no ordinary mark. This symbol held power, terrible, forbidden power. She could feel its malevolence seeping into her, worming its way into her thoughts. She stood frozen, her mind racing. She needed to act, but every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run as far as possible from this place that was no longer bound by the laws of the living. The air had grown thick with the stench of decay, and she could feel something watching her, something lurking just beyond the veil of darkness. Behind her, the gaping chasm still yawned, as if waiting to swallow her whole. And then, without warning, the whispers returned. Louder this time, clearer. You have seen too much. You cannot escape. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the voice echoed inside her mind. It wasn't just one voice now, it was many, overlapping, intermingling, each one filled with malice, each one clawing at her sanity. They were ancient, older than the bones of the earth itself, and they carried with them the weight of eons of suffering, torment, and death. In her mind's eye, Emily saw things, visions of a world far beyond her understanding. She saw vast, cyclopean cities made of black stone, where titanic figures loomed, their forms twisted and grotesque, their eyes blazing with ancient hatred. She saw the sky, dark and roiling with storm clouds, where monstrous shapes writhed and slithered among the stars. And she saw the void, the endless void, where formless things stirred, waiting, watching. They had been there before the first dawn, before the first creature had crawled from the primordial ooze, and they would be there long after the last star had gone out. These were the forces she had awakened. The board had not merely summoned a restless spirit, it had torn a hole in reality itself, allowing something far worse to peer through. Something that had no name, something that had been waiting for eons for a doorway to open. Emily stumbled backward, her legs weak, her mind reeling. She couldn't comprehend the full horror of what she had seen, but she knew enough. This was no game. The others, her friends, had been taken by it, consumed by the darkness they had unleashed. And now it wanted her. The sigil on the floor throbbed once more, the light flickering as if it were alive. With trembling hands, Emily pulled her phone from her pocket, the soft glow of the screen offering the smallest comfort in the overwhelming blackness. She dialed Claire's number, desperate to hear her sister's voice, to know that she was still alive. The call connected, but there was no voice on the other end. Only the sound of breathing, slow, ragged, inhuman. Emily's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. The thing on the other end of the line, it wasn't Claire. She dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The heartbeat was louder now, reverberating through the walls, shaking the house. She could feel it in her chest, in her skull, a relentless pounding that threatened to drive her mad. "You must leave this place, or you will never escape." The voice came again, but this time it was different, clearer, more direct. It wasn't the chorus of malevolent whispers. It was a single voice, urgent and desperate. Emily looked around, her eyes straining in the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift and move, as though something was stirring just out of sight. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, its form faint, like a smudge of smoke against the blackness. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face was a hollow void, a mask of nothingness. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "Leave now, while you still can." Emily's legs finally obeyed her command. She turned and bolted toward the door, her feet pounding against the floorboards. The darkness seemed to close in around her, pressing in on all sides, but she forced herself to keep moving. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the doors on either side yawning open like the mouths of great beasts, but she ignored them, focusing only on the exit. The front door loomed ahead, and with a final burst of energy she flung it open. Cold night air rushed in, chilling her to the bone. Emily stumbled out onto the porch, her lungs burning, her mind spinning. Behind her, the house groaned, as if it were alive, shifting and creaking like a thing waking from a deep slumber. She didn't stop running, not until she was far from that cursed place, her heart racing, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. But as she ran, one thought haunted her, lingering in the back of her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. The board was still in the house, and the door had been left wide open. Emily ran blindly into the night, her breath hitching in short, desperate gasps. The town around her felt eerily unfamiliar now, as though the fabric of reality had twisted, warping everything she had once known. The streets, once comforting in their mundane existence, now felt alien, as if they belonged to some otherworldly realm that bled into her own. Shadows crept from every corner, darker than the night itself, curling like the tendrils of some unseen horror. But what unsettled Emily the most was the silence. The town was dead quiet, unnaturally so. There was no sound of distant traffic, no wind rustling through the leaves, not even the hum of electric street lamps. Only the pounding of her heartbeat remained, an incessant drumbeat in the void. And behind it, always behind it, was the faint pulse of that terrible ancient rhythm she had felt in the house. She didn't stop running until she reached the small park on the outskirts of town, a place she and Claire had visited many times as children. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a solitary bench beneath the gnarled branches of an oak tree. Emily collapsed onto the bench, her body trembling, her mind spinning with everything she had seen. Her thoughts raced, memories of the Ouija board, the eerie sigil, and the terrible figure in the doorway with its hollow, void-like face. For a moment, she considered going to the police, but what could she say? That she and her friends had summoned something beyond comprehension using a board game meant for Halloween thrills? They would think her insane. But Emily knew the truth now, something the others would never understand. The board had been no mere game. It was a gateway, an ancient tool for communing with forces that no mortal mind could grasp. The darkness around her seemed to throb with a life of its own, and Emily could almost feel the invisible presence of eyes, unseen, unblinking eyes, that watched her from the shadows. She buried her face in her hands, trying to stifle the rising panic that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. The night pressed in around her, thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had been unleashed. And then, as if summoned by her own fear, the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was approaching wanted to be heard. She didn't dare turn around. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body was paralyzed with dread. The memory of the void-faced figure flashed in her mind, and she knew with sickening certainty that it had followed her here, out into the world. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and a voice, low and hoarse like wind scraping over dry bones, whispered her name. Emily. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakably Claire's. Emily, you should never have left. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, standing beneath the pale light of the moon, was her sister. But it wasn't Claire. The figure before her wore Claire's face, her features, her hair, even her clothes. But there was something profoundly wrong. The eyes, once warm and full of life, were now black, lifeless voids, staring blankly into her. A twisted grin spread across the thing's face, and as it moved closer, Emily could see the skin shifting unnaturally, like a mask draped over something far more monstrous. "Claire?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief. She backed away slowly, her mind reeling. This can't be real. The thing wearing Claire's face took another step forward, its movements jerky, as if its body didn't quite fit the form it had taken. Its smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, unnatural teeth. "You brought it here," the thing hissed. "You opened the door and now it's inside you." Emily shook her head, her heart racing. She stumbled backward, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing, this grotesque parody of her sister, this abomination that had crawled out from the depths of the abyss she had unknowingly unlocked. And then it struck her, the board, the sigil, the house. This thing had crossed over, and it was no mere spirit. It was something far older, far darker. Something that had waited in the shadows of forgotten realms, waiting for the foolish to tear open the veil. Emily had been its key. She turned and fled into the park, her feet pounding against the earth, her mind racing. The thing behind her did not follow immediately, but she could hear its laughter, soft, mocking, and filled with an ancient malice. It was toying with her, savoring her fear. As she ran, her thoughts returned to the house, the Ouija board, the door she had left open. She had to go back. She had to find a way to close it, to seal whatever she had let loose before it consumed her, and before it consumed the world. But how? She had no knowledge of these dark forces, no understanding of the eldritch rituals that might banish such a horror. She was alone, unarmed against an ancient evil. The town around her was still disturbingly silent, as if it too had fallen under the spell of the thing she had awakened. Lights flickered in the distance, but they offered no solace, no promise of safety. The world had changed, twisted by the breach she had unwittingly created. She reached the edge of the park and stopped, gasping for breath. In the distance, she could see the house, the place where it had all begun, standing like a sentinel in the night, shrouded in shadow. The very sight of it filled her with dread, but she knew she had no choice. She had to go back. But as she prepared to return to that cursed place, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A low, rumbling growl reverberated through the earth, as if the very soil was awakening to some terrible presence beneath. The air grew cold, and the sky above seemed to darken further, the stars vanishing one by one. Emily looked up, her eyes wide with terror. Something was coming. Something far worse than the thing that had worn her sister's face. And it was coming for her. The air grew colder as Emily approached the house, though the sun had not yet set. Her heart raced, the oppressive silence around her stretching the seconds into an eternity. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, as if the house itself was casting them out to greet her, welcoming her back to the nightmare she had foolishly unleashed. She clenched the sigil tightly in her trembling hand, its lines and shapes twisting before her eyes, as though alive with a force that defied reason. She could not shake the feeling of eyes upon her, as if the very earth beneath her feet was watching, waiting for her next step. But each time she turned, nothing was there. Her mind, she thought, must be fraying. How could it not, after witnessing her sister's face draped over something so grotesque, so wrong? With every step closer to the house, a deep, gnawing dread settled into her bones. She could not see it yet, but she felt it. A presence more ancient and terrifying than she had ever imagined. It was as if the fabric of reality was thin here, warping under the weight of something from another world, something that should never have been allowed to cross over. The front door, hanging slightly ajar, creaked ominously as she entered. The house felt different now, as if it had aged centuries in the few hours she had been away. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly, otherworldly energy, the wallpaper peeling and shifting like skin. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the cold seeped deeper into her, not just a chill from the air, but an icy hand wrapping around her very soul. Her gaze was drawn to the living room, where the Ouija board still lay, undisturbed yet humming with a sinister life of its own. She hesitated, a part of her wanting to run far from this cursed place, but she knew she could not escape what she had started. The sigil burned in her hand now, as if reacting to the malevolent energy swirling in the air. Suddenly, a voice, faint, distant, whispered her name. Emily froze, her heart pounding against her chest. The sound was soft, like the rustling of leaves, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. Emily. It was not a voice she recognized. It was not her sister, nor anyone from the living world. It was something else, something far older, something that had waited far too long for this moment. The whisper grew louder, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls themselves seemed to exhale as though the house was alive, breathing with anticipation. She looked down at the board where the planchette sat still. Her mind screamed to stop, to leave, but her hand, against her will, moved toward it. The sigil pulsed with a dark energy as her fingers touched the planchette. Suddenly the world shifted. The room around her bent, folding in on itself like a twisted mirror. Objects seemed to warp and stretch into impossible shapes, the walls twisting into grotesque faces that leered at her with hollow eyes. Reality itself was disintegrating, and in its place, a dark void opened, swallowing the house inch by inch. Emily staggered back, the floor beneath her feet rippling like water. She could no longer tell if she was awake or trapped in some terrible dream. Every fiber of her being screamed that she was no longer alone in this crumbling shell of a house. The presence was here, with her, in her. It permeated her every breath, every thought. The sigil flared in her hand, searing her palm. She screamed, dropping it to the floor, where it began to glow with a dull, sickly light. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Not her sister, not a person, but something that defied description. It was formless, its body shifting between shapes, always on the edge of perception, always too grotesque to fully comprehend. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound that echoed in her mind. A noise that was both ancient and eternal. A sound that carried the weight of infinite despair. You cannot close the door. Emily fell to her knees, clutching her head as the words hammered into her skull, each syllable driving her closer to the edge of madness. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it was collapsing inward, folding into the endless void. She was losing her grip on reality, and the thing, the entity that had been summoned, was feeding on her fear, her very essence. But through the overwhelming dread, through the haze of despair, a single thought cut through. She had to try. She had to close the portal, no matter the cost. Crawling towards the sigil, her hand shaking, Emily reached for it again. The burn of its touch, nothing compared to the terror consuming her. As her fingers closed around it, the house groaned, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The walls cracked, and the floor beneath her split open, revealing an abyss that reached far beyond the physical world. Dark, writhing tendrils emerged from the cracks, reaching for her, seeking to pull her into the void. And then she saw it, through the cracks, through the shifting reality around her, something much larger, much darker, waiting beyond the veil of this world. It was not just a spirit or an entity. It was ancient. It was cosmic. It had been waiting for eons, watching, hungering for the moment it could escape into the world of the living. Emily's mind shattered as she glimpsed it, an endless, unfathomable being whose very existence defied comprehension. The sigil in her hand flickered, its light dimming as the tendrils closed in. She knew in that moment that this was no longer just about her. The thing beyond the veil was far greater than she could ever stop. But she would try. With a final desperate scream, she thrust the sigil toward the board, hoping against hope that it would be enough to sever the connection, to close the door before the entity could fully cross over. The void roared in response, and the world began to collapse around her. The sigil glowed faintly in Emily's trembling hand, its light a feeble defense against the encroaching void. Around her, the house crumbled, the walls twisting and folding like paper being consumed by fire. Yet there was no heat, only the numbing cold of oblivion. She could feel the presence pressing in on her, a force so ancient and vast that her mind recoiled from even the slightest awareness of it. The ground beneath her rippled like a black ocean, and from its depths those writhing tendrils continued to emerge, dark, hungry things that reached for her with the intent of dragging her into the abyss. And beyond the rift in reality, she saw it again. The being, vast and incomprehensible, its form shifting between nightmare shapes, each more grotesque and alien than the last. It was not of this world, not even of this universe. Its very essence was anathema to existence. Emily's hand shook as she held the sigil, her body paralyzed with the knowledge that nothing she did could truly stop it. The entity was too powerful, too ancient, and its hunger too immense. She was merely a fragment of flesh in the presence of something eternal, something that had waited beyond the stars for a moment like this. Yet, despite the crushing weight of despair, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She had started this, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. Her sister's voice echoed faintly in her mind, distant and broken, but still calling to her from somewhere far beyond the veil. "Please, Emily, save me." Tears stung her eyes. She didn't know if it was truly her sister's soul trapped beyond the rift, or if it was a cruel mockery from the entity itself, luring her deeper into its web. But she couldn't abandon her. Not now. Emily looked toward the Ouija board, now fractured and hovering in midair as if suspended by invisible strings. The planchette was still, but the letters beneath it twisted and reformed, spelling out words that her mind struggled to comprehend. She couldn't hesitate. Time was slipping away. Reality itself was slipping away. Emily crawled toward the board, the tendrils from the void snapping at her feet, their cold touch brushing against her skin like death's fingers. She screamed as one of them wrapped around her ankle, pulling her toward the chasm in the floor. Desperately, she kicked, clawing at the wooden boards beneath her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as the tendril was about to pull her into the abyss, Emily drove the sigil into the crack, the ancient symbol pulsing with a blinding light. The tendril recoiled, hissing, as though the very touch of the sigil burned it. She felt a wave of dark energy pulse through the room, the ground shaking violently beneath her. For a moment she thought it had worked, that the portal was closing. But the entity beyond the rift laughed. It was not a sound, it was a presence, a vibration that hummed through her bones, a mocking echo of eternity. "You are nothing but a child grasping at shadows," it whispered in her mind. "The door cannot be closed, mortal. It has been opened for far too long. You are but a speck in the cosmic void. I am infinite." Emily's heart sank. The light from the sigil flickered, and the darkness grew heavier around her, the air thick with the stench of decay. The ground beneath her began to crumble again, and the tendrils surged forward, more relentless than ever. She could feel their icy touch, climbing up her legs, her waist pulling her down. And then she realized it. The sigil was never meant to close the door. It was meant to be a key. Her mind reeled as the truth unfolded in her, like some ancient forbidden knowledge. The sigil wasn't here to protect her or banish the entity. It was a tool of opening, not closure. The elders who had crafted it, who had passed it down through whispered secrets, had known of the entity's hunger, and they had sought to use it, to harness its power. But they had underestimated it, as she had. They had failed to see that the power they sought to control was beyond mortal comprehension, beyond the grasp of any human mind. "You are the door," the voice echoed in her head, resonating through her very soul. Her body stiffened with horror as the truth sank in. She had been the key all along. Her life, her soul, was the final piece to the portal's completion. The entity had not crossed over fully yet, but through her, it would. She had been marked the moment she touched the board, the moment she foolishly dabbled in forces she could never understand. The sigil in her hand burned brighter now, a final mocking light. The entity's tendrils enveloped her fully, pulling her closer to the void. Her screams were lost in the overwhelming sound of the house collapsing, the walls crumbling into darkness, the void expanding to consume all that was left of the room, the world. "Join me, and become eternal," the voice whispered, now soft, almost gentle. But Emily's heart beat with one last flicker of defiance. She knew now that she could not stop it. She had unleashed something that could not be undone, but she could make sure that it never used her as its gateway. With all her remaining strength, she raised the sigil and with a desperate cry, slammed it into her chest. There was a flash of searing light, brighter than anything she had ever seen, blinding, burning, and then silence. the tendrils froze, recoiling from her body as though repelled by the final act of defiance. The house shuddered, the air rippling with a deafening roar of anger, frustration, and then nothing. Emily collapsed to the ground, her vision fading, the sigil still clutched tightly in her hand. The house was gone, the portal sealed, not because she had closed it, but because she had severed herself from it. The entity had lost its gateway. As darkness consumed her, she smiled weakly, knowing that for now, the world was safe. But somewhere in the infinite reaches of the cosmos, the ancient entity still waited, still watching, waiting for the next door to open. The end.